So we're discussing how API lawyers can respond to the needs created by the new federal administration. I'm going to go next to Karen Wang, Program Director for One Justice. Karen, we've just heard from David on what he expects to see to the community at large, and especially how it impacts the API community with respect to immigrant family members, Asian hate, impacts relating to changes to federal government funding and programs, let's say. But if I could ask you, with respect to the needs in the API community so far, what have we seen, and in your view, what are we likely to see?
Great. Thank you, Charles, and thank you to Cal-APABA. And I'm sorry for the folks who didn't get to hear David's very sobering and accurate assessment. I will just say a big ditto to everything he said, unfortunately. Um, I join you in my current role at One Justice, which, if you don't know the org, our clients are actually the legal services community, primarily in California. So we train and support legal aid leaders and executives in running their organizations. So it gives me a really great lens into what's happening in the legal services, the community that serves the individuals on the ground who are most in need. Um, I guess I'll say a couple things, there's going to be some overlap with what David said. But there are also some differences because, as he pointed out, there is just so much going on. It's been really hard to track everything that is happening that impacts our community. But I'll talk about three, I think, major lines of attack that have come from the new administration in the past month, primarily through executive orders of questionable legality, but also other actions like defunding or attempts to defund longstanding programs. The first attack I'll mention is that it's a very core attack on, I think, our identities as Asian Americans. This has been carried out through the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI programs, which I think fails to capture, I think, most people's imagination of what that means is actually not. Um, doesn't accurately capture, I think, what those programs really mean and what the Trump administration is going after. So if you don't think the attacks on DEI affect you, take a look at the language of a couple of things that come out. Most specifically, I would say take a look at the January 21st executive order that is very explicit. It was the second day, I think, in office that there are multiple anti-DEI initiatives, I'm sorry, executive orders now, but that one actually took a broad swipe beyond the federal government at contractors and recipients of federal funding, but also at basically the nonprofit, corporate, and philanthropy sectors. It is encouraging the federal government to identify agencies to target for upholding DEI values. So this is going to ripple out, it's already started to ripple out into the broader community. Um, the other attacks on our community include things like the longstanding, I think the White House initiative on AAPIs has been disbanded under this administration. It survived multiple other non-democratic administrations, but did not survive this one. Besides the anti-DEI executive order, there was one that just came out over the weekend that was aimed at higher education. It was an executive order, it was framed as a letter from the Office of Civil Rights and Department of Ed. And as somebody who served for several years in a federal office for civil rights, it is really heartbreaking to see the Civil Rights Office issue language saying basically that you can no longer that race doesn't exist in our country. So this is what I mean when I say these attacks are on our identity as Asian Americans. Collectively, all of these actions by the administration are trying to tell us that our race as Asians doesn't matter. Well, all that matters is that that you need to subsume it. I think there's language that's out there from federal agencies saying it's not about integration, it's about assimilation. It's about kind of really stripping us of our cultural, racial, and language identities. And so that is what is underlying all of these anti-DEI actions. I will say in conversations specifically from the legal aid sector, so the people who are serving the kind of poorest and most vulnerable in our community, which includes fair number of Asian Pacific Islander refugees, immigrants, and citizens, there's a really strong fear among groups who have spent years now prioritizing diversifying their services, their staff in order to serve community members like our community members who don't speak English as a first language, that they are going to be singled out and attacked for funding withdrawal or lawsuits. So that is one attack. Our attack, the attack on us as Asian Americans through primarily these anti-DEI kind of reframing of the civil rights laws, kind of actions that the administration has taken. The other one, which I won't dwell on because David talked about it, I'm fairly confident Cecilia is going to talk at length about the attacks on immigrants and migrants. But I'll just add that this has had a really huge impact because so much of legal services, so much of who is poor and working poor in our own communities are people who are first generation immigrants who don't speak English fluently, who may have varying statuses that are now at jeopardy. One thing I will also say is I feel like as Asian Americans, many of us feel like when we talk about deportations, we're not talking about our community members. But if you are paying attention to the news, and there's a lot of news, so you may have missed this, one of the higher profile sets of articles on immigration talks about the number of people being flown to Central America now, deported from this country in chains. Quite a few of those, multiple hundreds, are actually Asian immigrants from China, from Central Asia, like from Iran and Afghanistan, from India. They're being sent there because they can't go back directly to their countries. But these are the people being chained. It's mothers and children, it's women, it's people who have not committed crimes that was supposed to be their target. Putting aside the issue whether we agree with that. So we'll just say, pay attention to what's happening because if you think that the deportations and that Trump promised to only go after the so-called, worst of the worst. He is deporting people from our community, he's deporting children. They have defunded significant programs that have funded immigration representation for decades. There are agencies that are representing immigrants who are now seeing their funding gutted even the last 2 days. There's a major program for unaccompanied children that was just unfunded by the Trump administration. So legal aids, I think the number one area we've seen legal aids see a need for help in is for sure immigration. It is not the only issue, but it is by far the biggest increase across the board. And tied to that are related issues like families worried about parents and children being separated, needing to put guardianship in place. People worried about notarial fraud because people are desperate. So now they're just going to anyone who will tell them something that sounds remotely good. So these are all the kind of ripple out effects of the attack on immigrants that are coming in through legal aid. And then I will just end by just, at least on the needs issue, then I have a couple comments on what lawyers can do, is just the poorest and most vulnerable in our communities are not just the people who are immigrants, but we're seeing the attempts to defund go much deeper. If you might, this feels like years ago now, but I think the first or second day of the administration, Trump administration tried to cut funding to nonprofits across the country, billions of dollars going to all sorts of services. And these are, services going to poor children. It's going to people who have disabilities. So some of that has been stopped in the courts, but as David mentioned, we are in this uncharted territory of where even when the administration is told, do not do this, it is illegal, put the money back. That money has not come back into the communities they're intended to serve. So we don't know what's going to happen to that. So that is for the poorest and most vulnerable in our community, it is a very, very scary time. I think it's scary for all of us who have the privilege of having law degrees and probably having jobs and having something to do during the day. But for many, many people in our community, it is an incredibly scary time. I'm just going to say a couple words about what folks can do as attorneys. I will echo what David said about, we as lawyers need to step up. If you do one thing, do two things. It doesn't even have to be a legal thing. But the most important thing I would underscore is do not obey in advance. If you are in a position to not do the things that the Trump administration is trying to intimidate all of us into doing before it needs to be done, do that because we are now seeing people starting to scale back and walk back commitments to race equity and inclusion. That includes our community, by people in our community will be affected by this walk back. Don't do that now. California is the best place to defend these issues, but we are already seeing organizations and companies start to scale back and do the work in advance of actually needing to legally be required to do it. So I heard a podcast the other day where someone was talking about having left Russia minutia and how the granting of authoritarian power doesn't come from laws or institutions. It comes from people. If we give the government the right to be authoritarians over us, that's where they will seize it. So it's up to us to stop that. As a lawyer, you can take pro bono work. I'm sure Cecilia will talk about this and Anthony as well. I will just mention you can take individual cases. You can volunteer for rapid response networks. That's to do know your rights work. You can take individual cases from Asian American groups. I'm going to drop into the chat a number of places where you can sign up for pro bono opportunities. Um, but I would also say if you have a chance to do defense litigation, it's not, besides the kind of work that NILC and ACLU and others are doing, I would say that I think organizations who defend DEI are going to be subject to litigation, and they will need lawyers to step up and defend them. Nonprofits don't have lawyers on retainer. They don't have people. They're not used to being sued. Many of them are really scared and they want to defend their clients and their staff, but they're afraid of being sued. So think about the ways you can get involved, but I would say that that is an important one. Um, if you want to make the transition totally to work, I was looking at all the Asian American legal groups in the state. Every single one right now has open staff attorney positions. So if you really want to be in the trenches and do this work, there are openings for you. And the last thing I'll say is that even if you don't want to do the legal work, there's so much you can do to support these legal aid organizations and nonprofits that are defending and serving the community on the front lines. Part of my organization's work is to encourage more attorneys, particularly diverse attorneys, to step into legal aid board roles. Legal aid board members do so much to fundraise for their organizations, to help guide their organizations during these tough times right now. So if you've never thought about it, consider doing that. There are resources that can train you and help you find opportunities. But as lawyers, we have unique skills that can actually be really useful for a lot of the nonprofits that are facing uncharted territory. Many of them are terrified of being sued. Many of them are looking for lawyers to join their board or provide counsel to guide them through these times. So I would just say, if you haven't thought about that, that's something to consider. And alongside that, please consider funding, giving money to organizations. If you can give $25, $5, $100, all these organizations are looking at losing funding in the next 4 years. Nonprofit community is actually heavily subsidized by federal dollars, indirectly or directly. So the changes that are coming are likely to gut legal services and immigrant rights organizations in the state of California. So funding from the community will do a lot to keep these organizations going.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Um, uh, I'll turn it over to Cecilia Wong at this point. Cecilia, from your perspective as the National Legal Director at ACLU, are there particular, maybe you could focus us in on those federal policies that you believe pose the biggest threats for Asian American communities. So I'll turn it over to
Thank you. Sorry, I kept making you do that. I was coughing while Karen was talking. So thank you, Charles, and to all the bar associations for putting this event together. It's really a good space to come together in community at a really tough time for all of us. So, one way I've been thinking about what Donald Trump is doing as president in his second term is that he's really, to take a step back, attacking the core principles of the Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Constitution, and also the second Reconstruction, which is the legal and policy fruits of the civil rights movement that overthrew Jim Crow, segregation, and racial violence in the 1960s. And if you start with one of the first things he did, birthright citizenship, which the ACLU has joined with Asian Law Caucus, LDF, and others in challenging alongside 7 other groups of plaintiffs, including City of San Francisco, as David said. Trump is trying to destroy this foundational principle, and one of the major corrections that was made after the Civil War that we're going to uproot slavery and have a multiracial conception of what it means to be an American in this country. And then one of the other first things he did was to rescind a number of 1960s era anti-discrimination executive actions, including a 1965 executive order that Lyndon Johnson issued in order to end blatant race discrimination in the federal contracting system, among other things. And so when you think about some of the major policy positions that the Trump administration has taken, legal positions that he's taken, they're really striking at the heart of the notion of an inclusive and multiracial democracy in the United States. And his orders aimed at destroying that vision for our country and instead instilling his vision of an exclusive idea of what it means to be American, favoring his favorite groups. So in addition to birthright citizenship, as Karen alluded to, I would not be doing my job if I didn't mention a few of the immigration policies that Donald Trump has put into place. Of course, this was a major focus of his first term in office. And in his second term, he has just started, by the way, to really ramp up his anti-immigrant attacks, which are really fundamentally anti-American attacks, because again, he's challenging the notion of what it means to be an American that we've worked so hard as a country to build over the last 200 years. Among the things that he's doing in the immigration area are various policies that are fundamentally premised on the idea of immigrants as invaders, right? He's explicitly said that he's declaring that there is an invasion at the US-Mexico border, and he's referring to families who are seeking asylum. And therefore has done things like used Section 212F of the Immigration Nationality Act, same statute he used to do the Muslim ban during his first term, in order to shut down all immigration at the southern border of the United States. He's also expanded expedited removal, which is a shortcut kind of kangaroo court system of deportation that has been used previously for people who are seeking admission to the United States, and bypasses the immigration courts, and just lets the executive branch deport people without any process. He's expanded that to nationwide application, including in the interior of the United States. He has most recently transferred immigrants who were in ICE custody in the United States to Guantanamo. And of course, he signed into law the Laken-Riley Act, which is one of the first actions taken by this Congress, Republican-led Congress in both houses, to drastically expand the use of mandatory detention, that is immigration detention without any individualized hearing to people, vast numbers of people. And by the way, the ACLU has challenged all of those policies, as well as birthright citizenship, the dismantling of birthright citizenship. I want to just note in talking about immigration that we should care about immigration not only because many of us are immigrants or second generation Americans or in any event descendants of immigrants, but because on a more basic level, what Donald Trump is doing is an attack on the concept of due process of law. The ways in which Donald Trump is still threatening, but has not yet carried out, as he puts it, the largest deportation operation in US history, is to take due process out of the deportation system. So he is still building a mass deportation system through ramping up of detention capacity, including potentially having tent encampment detention facilities for families in US military bases around the country, using privately run facilities, using many, many more county jails in order to detain massive numbers of people that he's trying to deport, and bypassing various ways that people have, even just a modicum of process in their deportation cases. And so as lawyers, as David Chu put it, as officers of the court, we should really be concerned about what he's doing on immigration. I'll call out one particular issue that has not yet gotten a lot of attention, and the ACLU at the ACLU are about to put out an open letter on this, and it's something I think we can all talk about, not only as lawyers but as Americans, is the ideological targeting of scholars and students on U.S. university and college campuses. Donald Trump has put out executive orders and a fact sheet from the White House that specifically calls on universities to target on an ideological basis, non-citizen students and faculty for deportation. He said people, for example, who've expressed pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine views should be targeted for deportation based on their expressed viewpoints. And this is something that I think, the reason that we're about to put out an open letter to university presidents is because, as Karen alluded to, there are many areas of American life where there's a real danger that people and institutions will start caving to the assertion of presidential power in ways that are really troubling and that are going to facilitate Trump's ability to break the law and to really dismantle and attack American communities. And this is one where I think if you are an alumnus or alumna of a university that ends up caving to the president's demands, we can all raise our voices up in trying to counteract that pressure from the White House. And that's one area where I think we can follow Karen's advice. Karen mentioned one area I was going to talk about as well, which is the attacks on so-called DEI policies. Let's call it what it is. These are Trump's attacks on anti-discrimination law, and therefore these are his pro-discrimination policies. Here, Karen already talked about it, and so I'll just really highlight that in these executive orders, the president is trying to use Asian Americans in a way to divide us against other people of color, and specifically has put whites and Asian Americans on one side of a conflict with other people of color. And I think that is something that has troublingly gotten some traction among parts of our communities, and something that we also should be speaking up against, because as Karen very wisely pointed out, these orders will affect us. They will censor the teaching of Asian American history, the teaching of Korematsu, the teaching of internment, the teaching, and in fact, Trump would rather this meeting not happen under those executive orders that are challenging DEI, are trying to dismantle DEI programs. And then finally, I would just mention that Trump is already using or exploiting and abusing the federal criminal legal system in ways that are discriminatory, both withdrawing criminal prosecution for politically motivated reasons, but also I'm sure we will see targeted criminal investigations and process in discriminatory ways. Of course, during his first term, he instituted the so-called China Initiative, which launched racially discriminatory criminal investigations of Chinese American scientists and scholars, accusing them of espionage for China. These were cases that my organization brought to try to seek redress for people who were ultimately exonerated, but who were targeted because of their Chinese Americans. And so why don't I leave it at that?
And Cecilia, David at the top of the hour quoted Steve Bannon in describing the strategy, right? So the so-called flood the zone strategy, or muzzle velocity, or shotgun approach. I mean, as advocates, as attorneys, it's hard to keep up. I mean, is there a particular area of focus where you think API lawyers in particular can plug in?
Really quickly, because we want to hear from Anthony. I would say echo what Karen said. We as lawyers, we can use the force for good. I think in particular, look for areas where there's a great need for individual representation. Deportation defense is one. Another is in employment. I've personally gotten a lot of outreach from the many federal government employees who have been terminated unfairly and unlawfully. And I think that's an area where I think the employment bar may be maxed out. And so that's another place where I'd say look for the individual representations where people otherwise would not have counsel at all. And then secondly, again, echoing Karen, I think it's really critical for us as Asian Americans to rise up in solidarity, regardless of race and ethnicity, regardless of our political affiliation, regardless of party. I think what Trump is doing is so beyond the pale that it's important for us to really build solidarity movements across the country. There are many things the ACLU is trying to do with our people power training events. We had hundreds of people in Nebraska, I think last night, show up in person in bad weather, bad winter weather, for an event to gather and see what can be done to oppose what the Trump administration is doing. And you can do that through API orgs, or you could do it through a local community, or you can do it as a lawyer, you can do it as just a concerned American. But I think all those things are really incumbent on us. And as I said earlier, look for the ways where your voice has a special resonance, like as if you're an alum of of a university that isn't doing the right thing to stand up to this censorship and intimidation. You put the pressure on to counteract what Donald Trump is doing.
All right, thank you, Cecilia. I'm going to invite Anthony to speak. Many of us, Anthony, are part of bar organizations, where either as members or leaders. I wonder if you could describe as organizations, as bar associations, how can we be of service?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm appearing today, just my personal capacity as a Cal-APABA board member and an attorney who's worked in legislative advocacy and legislative affairs for about 15 years. I currently work at DOJ, but as API Bar Association members, we all live and work in the API community. We network with API nonprofits, service providers, and advocates. We're familiar with the workings of government and policy making. So I think we're in a good position to identify and respond to the needs of the API community that are arising from the new federal administration. So thinking about ways that bar associations can help, there's a number of buckets, right? We have community education, right? We can help take complicated legal information and distill it down into a form that's more useful for the local community. There's a lot of confusion happening out there that we can help alleviate because of this flood the zone and these questionable legal positions that are being taken. So know your rights trainings are, for example, a really good example of a way that we can help educate the community in light of all these recent changes in immigration enforcement. What should people know if they come to contact with immigration authorities and make plans, right? Birthright citizenship. This is not something that people had to think about for a long time. It was so obvious what the answer was, but now there's a lot of misinformation about there. What's the status of this legal right that has purportedly been abolished by executive order and it's being challenged in the courts? So to the extent that we can help keep up to date on what's going on in the discourse and in the courts, we can help alleviate confusion there. And then community engagement. We talked about pro bono services. Not all of us are able to do that, but that is a great way if you can to help directly with people. I have a side gig helping people who are getting evicted. For It's so they actually enjoy doing it. Nothing to do with immigration enforcement, but it's a way that I keep my toes wet and help people in individual cases. But being a liaison to the community, right? Learning from people in the community what they're experiencing and what matters the most to them. You can help form relationships and networks for future action, right? We can all support nonprofit orgs that serve or protect our community, serving on other boards of directors or on fundraising, helping to fundraise for other nonprofits. This is going to be really critical going forward, where we're not going to have potentially resources from the federal government that we're normally used to having access to. Legislative advocacy, this is a field that I work in. And so I just want to encourage everyone to make your bar association's voice heard on important policy matters through the political process. And so legislative advocacy includes, working with other groups to help propose or co-sponsor legislation, to help research and strategize and draft language and build coalitions around uh, legislation. You can support or oppose legislation that's already been introduced. Today is actually the bill introduction deadline here in Sacramento. So there's about to be 1,000 new bills rolled out in the next couple of days that'll be popping up in the news. This is an easy way for organization to author a letter and get involved in the political process and submit it and make your voice heard. We can help organize the public to contact legislators and perhaps even engage in direct lobbying if that's in your capacity. And public relations and creating public pressure is also very important too, through social media, advertisement, newspaper op-ed pieces. We can amplify the message that we need to get out to people who need to hear it, to counteract a lot of the misinformation and propaganda that's coming out from the administration these days. And then lastly, trying to speed things up here because I know we're almost at time, but litigation, of course, lawsuits challenging the legality of policies proposed by the new administration. This is not something I've personally experienced in, but identifying opportunities to support litigation efforts by submitting an amicus brief or working with other groups to join an amicus brief. ACLU, my boss at DOJ, there are a lot of lawsuits being filed to help stand up against some of the things that are going on. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for amicus briefs there that'll be helpful for our community and where we're coming from. So I see we're at 12:52. Let me stop there. I know we want to do some questions and final points, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Anthony. And I do see in the chat a question about recommendations for places to donate. And I see a recommendation for ACLU, ALC, Democracy Forward, or local legal aid organizations like Bay Area Legal Aid or LAFLA. Feel free to put questions in the comments and we'll get to at least some of them, hopefully. But in the meantime, we are almost at time. I'll ask each of the panelists if they can identify a concrete step that, as attorneys, we can take. Whether it's joining rapid response networks, mentoring, advocating for state funding, even spreading the word. Ideas that come to mind for you, and I'll let people speak up individually as inspired.
Well, maybe I'll start right away. I'll just say, City Attorney Chu said we're in an emergency, and he's right. And we need to be in emergency preparedness mode at this point. So one concrete step we can all take is to organize within your bar association, to develop procedures that work for you, to be nimble, to respond to like crises and attacks on freedom that are going to crop up under this new administration overnight. Like they're just flooding the zone. You never know what kind of crazy thing is going to come out tomorrow morning. We need to be nimble and at the very least, take a stand, put out a public statement like immediately when something happens and be prepared to organize to get involved in advocacy or legal action. So being nimble and being able to respond when these things crop up instead of just saying, "Oh my God, it's another one. What are we going to do?"
And I'll just underscore there, as someone who's been a part of bar organizations for a long time now, sometimes bar orgs get stuck at this idea, wondering whether they can speak. The answer is they can speak, they can advocate, and they should advocate. And if there are any kind of lingering questions in that regard, please please reach out to Cal-APABA and maybe we can be of use. Cecilia or Karen, what stands out for you with respect to a concrete action that the audience members here can take today?
I'll give Cecilia the last word. I wanted to explain what I dropped in the chat. This memo, I think, has been circulating for a couple days from a number of law professors. It's a defense of DEI and civil rights, basically racial justice inclusion programs, in response to particularly the Department of Education memo that came out over the weekend. But the analysis is actually relevant. So I just wanted to put it there because I feel like one of maybe my biggest takeaway is I think as Asian American, well, I think the big thing is what's already been said is do something like do many things beyond what you're comfortable doing, whether it's giving money, whether it's, getting involved with a nonprofit to support it in its kind of coming turbulence that's coming. But as Asian Americans, we should also really 1,000% go to bat for quote unquote DEI, for racial equity and inclusion. Because as Cecilia said, it outraged me that the Department of Education memo specifically lumped Asians in with whites as a reason why, the department is now justifying kind of like removing funding for anything that touches on race, anything that acknowledges race, right? Not even decisions made on race. It's basically saying you can't even acknowledge race. And I don't want to be part of that. So I hope as Asian Americans, if you're here, you obviously self-identify as Asian Americans, you want to do something. Help us defend something that we have spent decades fighting for, that this administration is trying to overturn overnight. I don't think it should be on our backs, or on us. We need to do our part to fight that. But my official hat, I should say, please take up pro bono cases, give to legal services orgs because we are drowning right now, and this is just the beginning. The floodgates have not truly opened yet. That is yet to come.
Thank you, Karen. Cecilia?
Yeah, I would just echo what Karen and I think Anthony said as well, that, if the question is what can the bar associations here do, I think it's particularly important for us as Asian American lawyers to speak out against Trump's pro-discrimination policies because they're trying to use Asian Americans as a tool. And, let's be upfront about the fact that Asian Americans, like every other racial and ethnic group in the country, have a lot of, people in our communities who voted for Donald Trump. I have family members who voted for Donald Trump who are Asian American. And so I think it's especially important for us to speak out on those issues where they're trying to use our community as a wedge to divide a larger opposition to what he's doing to attack civil rights and civil liberties.
Okay. And I have one question from Shinong in the chat about sending out the resources. What I'll do is I'll post on Cal-APABA's community app the resources that were identified here in the chat. And so maybe that'll be useful to people. With that, are there any last comments before we close from our speakers? Okay, all right, seeing none. Yeah, deep appreciation to each of our panelists, Cecilia Wang, Karen Wang, Anthony Liu, and David Chu. Please stay tuned for the next installment in our series, which will be a Know Your Rights session. We have an additional session planned on countering hate. So please, in the meantime, engage on our community app, calapaba.app, and thank you for your participation.